We all grew up watching Disney's classics. The colorful worlds, the unforgettable songs, the magical happily ever afters. But what if I told you those heartwarming stories actually have much darker beginnings? I mean, we're talking about things like mutilation, death, and sacrifices that would make even Disney villains shudder. Disney didn't invent these fairy tales. The origins of your favorite movies lie in some pretty grim, no pun intended, stories filled with tragedy, punishment, and hard life lessons. So let's explore how Disney turned these tales into the magical stories we know today, and what they lost or maybe even gained along the way. Before we dive into the Disney versions, let's look at where these stories came from. Fairy tales weren't always made for kids. These were cautionary tales warning about life's dangers, teaching people how to survive in a pretty unforgiving world. Writers like the brothers Grimm, Hans Christian Andersen, and Charles Perrault collected these stories, and let me tell you, they didn't shy away from darkness. These tales were filled with brutal punishments, impossible choices, and endings that weren't always happy, or even hopeful. Children's tales are universal, timeless wisdom spun into a narrative. Jacob Grimm. But then Walt Disney came along, and let's be honest, he was kind of a genius. He looked at these stories and thought, what if we turn these into movies that don't traumatize everyone? And thus, Disney fairy tales were born. Now let's compare some of Disney's most famous movies to the original versions. Trust me, things get pretty wild. In Disney's Cinderella, the stepsisters are nasty and selfish, but their punishment, they don't get the prince, that's it. But in the original Grimm version, these stepsisters go to extremes. They literally cut off parts of their feet to fit into the slipper. And when their plan fails, birds peck out their eyes as punishment during Cinderella's wedding. Yeah, not quite the happily ever after you remember. The stepsisters were punished with blindness for their wickedness. Grimm's Cinderella. Next up, The Little Mermaid. Disney gave us a love story with singing crabs, a happy wedding, and a perfectly wrapped up ending. But Hans Christian Andersen, he wasn't about that. His version is utterly heartbreaking. When the mermaid gets her legs, every single step feels like walking on broken glass. The prince doesn't even marry her, he chooses someone else. And to make it worse, she has a chance to kill him to save herself. But instead, she sacrifices her life, dissolving into sea foam. No happy ending, just existential dread. But a mermaid has no tears, and therefore she suffers so much more. Hans Christian Andersen. And then there's Sleeping Beauty. Now, Disney's version gives us Aurora, a sleeping curse, and true love's kiss. But in one older version of the story by Giambattista Basile, the prince doesn't wake her with a kiss. He violates her while she's asleep. She actually wakes up giving birth to two twins. So yeah, there's quite a good reason Disney left that part out. In fact, the original tale of Sleeping Beauty is so dark that it's almost unrecognizable from what Disney made. Instead of the innocent fairy tale we know today, Basile's version features violence, manipulation, and a waking moment that's more akin to a horror story than a love story. So why did Disney make these changes? Well, Walt Disney had one big goal: to create stories that brought people joy. He wanted movies that were magical, uplifting, and family-friendly. And honestly, can you imagine kids today sitting through Cinderella's stepsisters slicing off their toes? Yeah, not exactly popcorn material. By softening the edges, Disney made these stories more accessible to everyone, giving us the feel-good fairy tales we love today. But there's another side to this. Some people argue that in removing the darker elements, Disney also stripped these stories of their deeper moral lessons and complexity. Fairy tales do not give the child his first idea of the bogey. What fairy tales give the child is his first clear idea of the possible defeat of the bogey. G.K. Chesterton. That said, Disney didn't erase all the darkness. It still lingers in their movies, just in smaller, more subtle ways. For example, think about how the villains met their ends. Ursula is impaled, Gaston falls to his death, and Scar is torn apart by hyenas. Even Disney couldn't completely sanitize the idea of karma. And let's not forget that Disney movies still deal with heavy themes: parental death, exile, betrayal. They might have some bright colors and happy songs, but these stories aren't all sunshine and rainbows. So why do we still love these stories? Whether they're dark or magical, I think it's because fairy tales at their core speak to something universal. They're about transformation, resilience, and hope. Even in the original versions, these characters face impossible challenges and somehow find a way to survive, or at least leave their mark. Maybe that's why these stories have lasted for centuries. They remind us that even when life is dark and cruel, there's always a chance for something better. Disney may have turned these grim tales into magical escapes, but their origins remind us that fairy tales were never just about happy endings. They were survival stories about sacrifice, resilience, and the harsh truths of life. So what do you think? Did Disney improve these stories, or did they lose something important along the way? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content.